There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. John Sitilides is with us here in Washington. He's a global risk analyst and a consultant to the U.S. State Department. Joining us from Ramallah is the former spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority, Nour Odeh. With us from Tel Aviv is Yossi Mekelberg. He focuses on the Middle East as a senior research fellow with Chatham House and heads the International Relations Department at Regent's University, London. And Daniel Serwer is the Academic Director of Conflict Management at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Daniel, let me start with you. You are the conflict management expert. And if we look at what's going on in the Middle East, let's look at what happened today. We had the United States open an embassy in Jerusalem, just a few miles away. We had major demonstrations, dozens of Palestinians killed, thousands injured. What do you make of what you see there?
Well, this is a gigantic contrast, but both arise from the same conflict. The Israelis have wanted embassies in Jerusalem for a long time. President Trump has conceded that with no quid pro quo whatsoever. And that, of course, will arouse a great deal of opposition on the Arab side. In the meanwhile, Gaza is in desperate conditions, and it's not surprising that the 70th anniversary of what the Arabs regard as the Nakba, the Israelis, the Jews in particular, regard as their day of independence, that all of this comes to a head at the same time.
Let's go to Yossi in Tel Aviv. And Yossi, President Trump says that what he's done here is effectively taken Jerusalem off the table. This is one of the most controversial issues in these negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. It's a very combustible issue. He says, I've taken it off the table. Is this going to help the cause of peace in that region or make it worse?
How can you take Jerusalem off the table? Jerusalem is at the heart of the conflict. It's a major part of the core issues, part of refugees, two-state solution, borders. You can't take it off the table without actually resolving both Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state and the Jewish state. So what he did, he prejudiced any future agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. He says, I recognize the right of the Jewish state as having Jerusalem as its capital, and I completely ignore the rights of Palestinians to have it. Go back to any negotiations in the last 20 plus years, and you see this one of the issues that's caused the peace process to collapse, including in Camp David in 2000. If he really wanted to take Jerusalem off the table, he should have either wait for a final status agreement and then recognize both, or do it now. What he did now, he just entrenched the conflict over Jerusalem.
Nour, what is the Palestinian view on what we saw today? We had the U.S. Embassy opening in Jerusalem. What is there for the Palestinians to negotiate right now? We see President Trump saying he wants to take Jerusalem off the table. We also see the expansion of settlements in occupied territories. What is there left? Is there anything that the Palestinians can now negotiate?
Well, as your guest in Tel Aviv said, Jerusalem is at the heart of the table. Without Jerusalem, there is no table. There is nothing to negotiate on. What the U.S. administration has done is basically send a message to the Palestinians that the weaker side of this equation, the occupied in this situation, have no rights, that the U.S. administration has no regard for their rights, for their aspirations, for their legitimate claim to Jerusalem as well, for international law. And as such, they celebrated the end, the demise of the peace process as we've known it for the past 20 plus years, while the Israeli occupation army was killing dozens of Palestinians with American cover.
I want to ask you about those protests, those demonstrations that took place in Gaza. Dozens of people killed, thousands of wounded. These demonstrations have been going on for weeks right now. What does it tell you about Israel's response to Palestinian protests?
Well, look, Israel faces a crisis when it's confronted with peaceful Palestinian protesters. And you can see that with the kind of aggressive reaction with the measures taken against protesters in Gaza. There are thousands upon thousands of Palestinians on the eastern border of the Gaza Strip protesting. And yes, some of them get close to the border with Israel proper. Some of them even breached the border. None of them were armed to kill dozens of Palestinians. More than the number of Palestinians killed over the past 7 weeks in less than 12 hours is an indication of how emboldened Israel feels right now, how protected, how shielded it feels. At the United Nations, they have Nikki Haley, who will ensure that the UN Security Council will not assume its responsibility towards peace and security, towards ensuring respect for UN Security Council resolutions. And at the international arena, they're very comfortable with the kind of protection that Trump is affording Israel and the cowardice, frankly, of the rest of the international community.
John, what is your view on what President Trump has done here? And we have to remember that this was a campaign promise that he would move the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Has he made a very complicated situation even more complex right now?
He's followed through on the promises made by Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. This began in 1995 with the Jerusalem Embassy Act, and George Bush supported Clinton's policy, and the U.S. Senate ratified that act by a vote of 95-0, completely bipartisan, unanimous support in the Senate for moving the embassy to Jerusalem. They just chose to follow the 6-month waiver that was embedded in the legislation so that it was never actually implemented. And even President Obama, who may not have specifically supported that legislation, called Jerusalem the capital of Israel. And so Donald Trump had made very clear in 2015 and 2016 that he would be implementing this policy. There's been several years of preparation from all sides. And I think the very unfortunate part here is the call by the Prime Minister of Gaza, Prime Minister Sinwar. Several weeks ago, he called on the Arabs of Gaza, the Palestinian people who need desperately for a decent life and a decent opportunity, and instead have the Hamas government building tunnels and repurposing resources and turning them into weapons and sending them out to the border with Israel, where the IDF has been making very clear they will not allow for the border with Israel to be breached and any attacks made on Israeli security, infrastructure, or the population. This is a horrific situation that's been unfolding, and almost all of the blame really lies at the feet of the Hamas leaders.
We have heard those arguments before. The counter to those arguments is that...
That's very convenient. Huh?
Right. Go ahead, Nour Odeh. You want to say something?
It's very convenient to blame the victim, and there is no Prime Minister of Gaza, just to correct your guest over there in the studio. The fact that Palestinians are protesting inside their territory against the siege laid to 2 million Palestinians by Israel against international law, against the denial of their rights, and that Israel has the audacity to blame them for their own deaths, and to have people peddle these talking points and market them without batting an eye is really astonishing. You're basically finding excuses for grave violations of international law, violations that have been condemned unanimously and across the board by all self-respecting human rights organizations inside Israel and across the world.
There's still a very serious divide between the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas leadership in Gaza. As a matter of fact, the PA isn't paying salaries and providing essential obligations for government resources and responsibilities in Gaza because of this political divide. And unfortunately, we see this playing out. The Palestinians in Gaza are ruled by a terrorist organization that is being paid for by the Iranian government in the form of Hamas. The Palestinian Authority, unfortunately, has almost no rule over the Palestinians in Gaza, and these are basic facts.
I hear that. Yossi, you wanted to say something?
But this is exactly changing the causality here. The Hamas is the result of not resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not only the Israelis, and yes, it has to do at the time with the election of the Hamas, with the corruption among the Fatah movement and their inability to actually to serve their own people properly. But the Hamas, at the end of the day, is a result of it. The people that are paying that, they are not necessarily Hamas members. Those are the people that live for 10 years now under blockade. Those are the people that live in poverty, unemployment, with no access to sanitation, clean water. This is the issue. We can blame the Hamas as much as we like, and we don't have to like the Hamas, but we need to make sure that the people of Gaza are looked after, make sure that they don't live in an open-air prison, that they have access to food, to clean water. That's the issue.
Yeah, no, I want to move back to the relocation of the embassy, and let's listen to what the United States National Security Advisor John Bolton had to say about this movement. Let's watch.
It will make it easier. You know, it's a recognition of reality. If you're not prepared to recognize that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and that's where the American embassy should be, then you're operating on a completely different wavelength. I think recognizing reality always enhances the chances for peace.
A recognition of reality, this will make it easier to achieve peace. Do you agree?
It certainly doesn't make it easier to achieve peace. It is a recognition of reality. Everybody understood that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. That's where its parliament meets. That's where its prime minister sits. That's where its president sits. There's no question about that, and never has been. The question is about whether the Palestinians will also have a capital in Jerusalem. And that issue is not helped by what the Americans did, because they did it in a very unbalanced way.
So are you saying that what we have seen today in Jerusalem is not a done deal, that this is still open to negotiation?
No, it's a done deal that the American embassy will be in Jerusalem and presumably in that place. What's not a done deal, and which can't be a done deal with unilateral action by the Israelis, is whether there will be a Palestinian capital also in Jerusalem. Whether Jerusalem will be divided or a unified city is still in doubt. There's a lot that still has to be settled. And this move of the American embassy, who cares where the American ambassador sits, frankly? I don't care, and I suspect he's been sitting there for quite some time already. That's not the issue. The issue is where the Palestinian capital will be and whether there'll be a Palestinian state. And this act by the United States doesn't help to clarify that whatsoever.
John, I'll get to you in a moment. I'm going to go to Nour Odeh and ask her about that. Nour, is it still the Palestinian hope that one day the capital of a Palestinian state will be in Jerusalem, that what we've seen today is not really the final borders of Jerusalem? We're going to see negotiations. We could still yet see a capital in Jerusalem for the Palestinians.
Well, Anna, the Palestinians have absolutely no doubt that regardless of what this American administration says or does, Jerusalem is an integral part of Palestinian history and the Palestinian nation. We are there on the ground in Jerusalem. We've been there for thousands of years, and we're not going anywhere. Peace will not come to this tormented land without an actual solution based on minimum justice. And minimum justice would require that Jerusalem is the capital of two states, Israel and Palestine. The Palestinians have long proposed that this city remain open and undivided, shared by an independent Palestine and an independent Israel. Trump has complicated that. The presence of this extremist right-wing government in Israel makes it very difficult and certainly nowhere near implementation. But I don't think that there is a Palestinian who can envision a future of dignity and freedom without Jerusalem. It is just an impossibility.
All right, what is your view on that, John? Because we also have to remember that Israel has claimed sovereignty over the entire city.
That's correct, as of today. But I think what I'm hearing from some of my co-panelists is partially correct in that this is still going to be an open issue for negotiation, and the Israelis know that there's going to be some type of a division of Jerusalem politically in order to be able to bring the Palestinians to the table. But I think also if we heed the words of the Saudi Prince bin Salman, who called on the Palestinians themselves to begin to more energetically embrace a process for negotiating a solution to this very, very difficult situation dating back decades, and really offer the Palestinian people the kind of promise, the kind of opportunity, the kind of lives that they deserve. That's still very much in the cards. So this is where the embassy is today. This is where Jerusalem is today. The final status is still to be resolved between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Yossi, what is your view on this? There was an Egyptian analyst who was writing in Foreign Policy magazine, and he says that with this embassy move, President Trump has effectively killed his own peace process.
Well, I'm not so sure there is a peace process to kill. We first need to see there is any peace process to begin with. But let me take you back to what John Bolton said, and tell you that the first time in my life I actually agree with John Bolton. He said, let's recognize reality. If you want to recognize all the realities, there are Palestinian people that don't have a state. Why the United States won't recognize Palestine as an independent state? Let's recognize reality. There are 5 million people registered with UNRWA as refugees. Let's deal with this reality that it can be just and fair for 5 million people to live under these conditions. So there are multiple realities need to address. And let alone what the previous speaker said about Jerusalem also is the capital as an open city, not building walls between West and East, but as capital of both as an open city to everyone in the world. So if you want reality, why such a specific reality? Now, we are waiting for a Trump plan for more than a year now. And every time we say, oh, there's going to be a plan, there's going to be a plan. And when they say their plan, say, we're not going to show anyone. We need to see what is the plan, what it is based on. Is it actually a sustainable, just for everyone plan that can bring the Israeli and Palestinians around the table? Or if the indication what we saw today, which is a unilateral, one-sided one, I think he can spare us his plan altogether.
Daniel, there was a reason all the other previous presidents did not move the embassy to Jerusalem. They did not want to complicate efforts before a final status was reached on the city, on Jerusalem itself. And I'm wondering, to what extent was this move by President Trump an effort to score political points with his domestic base here? In other words, is this less to do with Israel and more to do with Trump satisfying his political base?
That's the only reason I can think of that's rational for doing this. And it's quite clear that parts of his political base support this move. I hasten to add that it's not the Jewish part of his political base that necessarily supports it. There are some leading Jewish figures who Sheldon Adelson in particular, who likes this idea. But the bulk of the American Jewish community does in fact vote mostly Democratic and is opposed to this move. The constituency that really likes this is the Christian evangelicals. And they're strongly supportive of it. And I suppose there's benefit to Trump in satisfying that constituency, though I don't really quite see the point since they're going to vote for him anyway, almost no matter what. But this makes no sense in international relations terms. It makes sense only in domestic political terms. And even there, the sense it makes is tenuous.
Nour, what about the Palestinian constituency, particularly that constituency that supports President Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority? When you see something like this happen, when the United States moves its embassy to Jerusalem, when you hear the response from Israel, when you see what happens in Gaza, what does that do to the credibility of a person like Mahmoud Abbas?
Look, I do not envy anybody right now in the Palestinian leadership, including President Mahmoud Abbas. He has been advocating an agenda of negotiations and a peaceful resolution to the conflict since 1974. And time and again, and year after year, Israel has undermined this agenda, has made him look weak and ineffective, and has made the idea of establishing a Palestinian state seem almost impossible for Palestinians. But I think there's another dimension to this that is equally dangerous. What the American administration has done today is not just undermine Palestinian rights, but also undermine international law. There are UN resolutions that outlaw the transfer of embassies to Jerusalem. UN resolutions that consider East Jerusalem occupied Palestinian territory, the UN Charter that outlaws the acquisition of territory by force. So for the US to be ignoring all of these, shoving them aside, shoving all of these legal realities and facts aside, and dictating a reality that serves domestic purposes and absolutely no purpose of peace here on the ground makes anybody who talks about the two states or peace or negotiations look like a fool.
Yossi, you know, there's still lots of talk about a two-state solution. Just a moment ago, when we were talking about the peace process, you made the point that there is no peace process to be killed right now. Yet there are politicians, senior politicians here in the United States, who believe that there still is a possibility of a two-state solution. This was what the Republican senator, a very senior senator here, a very senior politician, Lindsey Graham, this is what he had to say on American television over the weekend. Let's watch.
No, because it can't be. If you had one state that was Jewish in nature, eventually you'd have to have some kind of apartheid where Arabs and Palestinians couldn't vote. Two states means a Jewish state with an Arab component, a Palestinian state living in dignity side by side with Israel. The problem is the Palestinians are divided. You have Hamas controlling Gaza, the Palestinian Authority controlling the West Bank. Gaza is a rocket launching factory against Israel. Until the Palestinians reconcile under one flag, there will never be peace.
Right, and Yossi, when the senator said no there, he was answering the question on whether he believed that the two-state solution is dead. What is the view in Israel? Do Israelis still believe, at very senior levels of government, that there is the possibility of a two-state solution?
I think we need to separate between the government, which I don't think there are many people there not only believe that want a two-state solution. Every act that they do, including the expansion of the settlement, points towards trying to hinder a two-state solution. Or if you look at public opinion polls, there is still around half of the population, probably more, if you set certain criteria that would support a two-state solution. When I say there is no peace process that will lead, it's not because I don't think that there should be a two-state solution. Probably if you compare it to any other solution on the table or potentially, this is still, I think, the only one that is viable. But without leadership, that can lead towards it. And yes, the Palestinians need a different leadership that is united. The Israeli needs altogether a different leadership. Without this, and working from bottom up, and have grassroots organizations that push towards that, it's not going to happen. And we need also an international community that is engaged. If there is no leadership from the United States, should come leadership either from Europe, the United Nations, because at the end of the day, the events that we see today in Gaza, it's a tragedy that was waiting to happen. And when commentators kept saying that, you know, there must be some urgency towards building a peace, everyone ignored and said the situation is sustainable, and here are the results today.
Very quickly, John, I've got 15 seconds, unfortunately. Will there be a two-state peace solution?
We pray that eventually there will be, but as the gentleman just stated here, political leadership is required here. I think you have a more responsible leadership, relatively speaking, in the Palestinian Authority. And notice that you don't have any of this kind of border breaching happening along the Palestinian Authority's borders with Israel. It's all coming out of Gaza. And if we don't recognize the nature of the leadership of Hamas, paid for by Iran, engaging in terrorist activities nonstop against Israel, then the Palestinians can't be united to be able to work at a peace plan with the Israelis.
You mentioned something, and Daniel, I'm just going to stretch the show a bit to get your view on this. Is there a role for another major power, perhaps the European Union, to enter into what is going on in the Middle East now, to act as a broker?
Look, the role of the United States was not really to act as a broker. It was to deliver Israel to a solution that it might not otherwise accept. So you can't do without the United States. Sure, you might have the Europeans or others involved in the mediation process, but in the end, you're going to require the United States to deliver Israel.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.